Dee Dee's conscience was not quite easy. She became excited and said more than she really intended to. The uncle arose after her last words. He gave her such a look that she took several steps backward. Then he stretched out his arm and said sternly, "Get you down from where you came, and don't show yourself here again very soon." Dee did not need to be told twice. "Goodbye, then, and goodbye to you too, Heidi," she said quickly, and hurried down the mountain to Derfly as fast as she could go, for her great agitation forced her onward, as if she were a powerful steam engine. In Derfly, many more asked her about Heidi. They all knew Dee well, and whose child Heidi was, and all that had taken place. When from every door and window came the question, "Where is the child, Dee? Where have you left the child?" she called back with more and more irritation, "Up with the arm, uncle! Up with the arm, uncle, I tell you!" She was disgusted because the women everywhere exclaimed, "How could you do so? The poor little soul! And such helpless little thing left up there!" And then again and again, "The poor little soul!" Dee pushed on as fast as she could and was glad when she was out of their hearing. She did not quite feel easy about the matter, for the dying mother had given the child to her. But she quieted her misgivings by saying to herself that it would not be long before she could do something again for the child, since she would be earning a good deal of money, so she felt very glad that she would soon be in a fine situation and far away from all the people who would speak to her about the matter. After Dee had disappeared, the uncle sat down again on the bench and blew a great cloud of smoke from his pipe, while he kept his eyes fixed on the ground without saying a word. Meanwhile, Heidi was content to look about her. She discovered the goat's shed built near the hut and peeped into it. It was empty. The child continued hunting about and came to the fir trees behind the hut. The wind was blowing hard, and it whistled and roared through the branches high up in the tops. Heidi stood still and listened. When it stopped somewhat, she went around to the other side of the hut and came back to the grandfather. When she found him in the same place where she had left him, she placed herself in front of him, put her hands behind her, and gazed at him. Her grandfather looked up. "What do you want to do?" he asked, as the child continued standing in front of him without moving. "I want to see what you have in the hut," said Heidi. "Come along, then," said the grandfather, and he rose and started into the hut. "Bring your bundle of clothes along," he said as he entered. "I shan't want them any more," replied Heidi. The old man turned around and looked sharply at the child, whose black eyes shone in expectation of what might be inside the hut. "She's not lacking in brains," he said half to himself. "Why won't you need them any more?" he asked aloud. "Oh, I'd rather go with the goats, with their swift little legs." "So you shall, but bring the things along," commanded the grandfather. "They can be put up into the cupboard." Heidi obeyed. The old man opened the door, and Heidi followed him into a good-sized room, which occupied the whole hut. In it were a table and a chair. In one corner was the grandfather's bed, in another the fireplace where hung the kettle, and on the other side, in the wall, was a large door, which the grandfather opened. It was the cupboard. There hung his clothes, and on one shelf lay his shirts, stockings, and linen. On another were plates, cups, and glasses, and on the topmost a loaf of bread, smoked meat, and cheese. Everything the uncle owned and needed for his living was kept in the closet. As soon as he had opened the door, Heidi came running with her bundle and pushed it in as far back of her grandfather's clothes as possible, that it might not be easy to find it again. Then she looked carefully round the room and said, "Where shall I sleep, grandfather?" "Wherever you like," he replied. This was quite to Heidi's mind. She looked into every nook and corner to see where would be the best place for her to sleep. In the corner by the uncle's bed stood the little ladder which led to the hayloft. Heidi climbed this. There lay a fresh, fragrant heap of hay, and through a round window one could look far down into the valley below. "Oh, this is where I'll sleep," Heidi called down. "It's lovely. Just come up and see how lovely it is up here, grandfather." "Oh, I know all about it," sounded from below. "I'm going to make a bed," called out the child again as she ran busily to and fro in the loft. "You must come up here and bring a sheet, for the bed must have a sheet for me to sleep on." Well, well, said the grandfather below, and after a few moments he went to the cupboard and rummaged about. Then he drew out from under his shirts a long, coarse piece of cloth, which might serve for a sheet. He came up the ladder and found that a very neat little bed had been made in the hayloft. The hay was piled up higher at one end to form the pillow, and the bed was placed in such a way that one could look from it straight out through the round open window. "Oh, that's very nicely. Made very nicely," said the grandfather. "Next comes a sheet, but wait a moment." And he took up a good armful of hay and made the bed as thick again, in order that the hard floor might not be felt through it. "There. Now, put it on." Heidi quickly took hold of the sheet, but was unable to lift it, it was so heavy. However, this made it all the better because the sharp wisps of hay could not push through the firm cloth. Then the two together spread the sheet over the hay, and where it was too broad or too long, Heidi quickly tucked it under. Now it appeared quite trim and neat. Heidi stood looking at it thoughtfully. "Oh, we've forgotten one thing, grandfather," she said. "What's that?" he asked. "The coverlet. When we go to bed, we creep in between the sheet and the coverlet." "Is that so?" "But supposing I haven't any?" asked the old man. "Oh, then it's no matter," said Heidi soothingly. "We can take more hay for the coverlet." And she was about to run to the haymow again, but her grandfather prevented her. "Oh, wait a moment," he said, and went down the ladder to his own bed. Then he came back and laid a large, heavy linen bag on the floor. "Isn't that better than hay?" he asked. Heidi pulled at it with all her might and main, trying to unfold it, but her little hands could not manage the heavy thing. Her grandfather helped, and when it was finally spread out on the bed, it all looked very neat and comfortable, and Heidi, looking at her new resting place, admiringly said, "That is a splendid coverlet, and the whole bed is lovely. How I wish it were night so I could lie down on it." "I think we might have something to eat first," said the grandfather. "What do you say?" In her eagerness over the bed, Heidi had almost forgotten everything else. But now that eating was suggested to her, a great feeling of hunger rose within her, for she had taken nothing all day except a piece of bread and a cup of weak coffee early in the morning, and afterward she had made the long journey. So Heidi heartily agreed, saying, "Yes, I think so too." "Well, let us go down, since we are agreed," said the old man, and followed close upon the child's steps. He went to the fireplace, pushed the large kettle aside, and drew forward the little one that hung on the chain, sat down on the three-legged wooden stool with a round seat, and kindled a bright fire. Almost immediately the little kettle began to boil. The old man held over the fire a large piece of cheese on the end of a long iron fork. He moved it this way and that until it was golden yellow on all sides. Heidi looked on with eager attention. Suddenly a new idea came to her mind. She jumped up and ran to the cupboard and kept going back and forth and back and forth. When the grandfather brought the toasted cheese to the table, it was nicely laid, with a round loaf of bread, 2 plates, 2 knives, for Heidi had noticed everything in the cupboard and knew that all would be needed for the meal. "That's right. To think of doing something yourself," said the grandfather, laying the cheese on the bread and putting the teapot on the table. "But there's something still lacking." Heidi saw how invitingly the steam came out of the pot, and she ran quickly back to the cupboard, but there was only one little bowl there. Heidi was not long puzzled. Behind it stood 2 glasses. The child immediately came back with the bowl and glasses and placed them on the table. "Very good. You know how to help yourself, but where are you going to sit?" The grandfather himself was sitting in the only chair. Heidi shot like an arrow to the fireplace, brought back the three-legged stool, and sat down on it. "Well, you have a seat, sure enough, only it's rather low," said the grandfather. "But in my chair, also, you would be too short to reach the table. Still, you must have something anyway, so come." Saying that, he rose and filled the little bowl with milk and placed it on the chair and pushed it close to the three-legged stool. So Heidi had a table in front of her. The grandfather laid a large piece of bread and a piece of golden cheese on the chair and said, "Now, eat." He seated himself on the corner of the table and began his dinner. Heidi grasped her bowl and drank without stopping, for all the thirst of her long journey came back to her. Then she drew a long breath and set down the bowl. "Do you like the milk?" asked the grandfather. "I never tasted such good milk before," answered Heidi. "Then you must have some more." And the grandfather filled the bowl again to the brim and placed it before the child, who looked quite content as she began to eat her bread after it had been spread with the toasted cheese soft as butter. The combination tasted very good, with frequent drinks of milk. When the meal was over, the grandfather went out to the goat shed to put it in order, and Heidi watched him closely as he first swept it clean with a broom, and then laid down fresh straw for the animals to sleep on. Then he went to his little shop, cut some round sticks, shaped a board, made some holes in it, put the round sticks into them, and suddenly, it was a stool like his own, only much higher. Heidi was speechless with amazement as she saw his work. "What is it, Heidi?" asked the grandfather. "It's a stool for me." "Because it's too high." "You made it all at once," said the child, still deeply astonished. "Ha! She knows what she sees. Her eyes are in the right place," remarked the grandfather to himself as he went round the hut, driving a nail here and there. Then he repaired something about the door, and went from place to place with hammer and nails and pieces of wood, mending and clearing away wherever it was needed. Heidi followed him step by step, watched him with the closest attention, and everything he did interested her very much. Evening was coming on. It was beginning to blow harder in the old fir trees, for a mighty wind had sprung up and was whistling and moaning through their thick boughs. It sounded so beautiful in Heidi's ears and heart that she was quite delighted, and skipped and jumped under the firs as if she were feeling the greatest pleasure of her life. The grandfather stood in the doorway and watched. A shrill whistle sounded. Heidi stopped her jumping, and the grandfather stepped outside. Down from above came goat after goat, leaping like a hunting train, and Peter in the midst of them. With a shout of joy, Heidi rushed in among the flock and greeted her old friends of the morning, one after the other, and two lovely, slender goats, one white and one brown, came out from the others to the grandfather and licked his hands, in which he held some salt to welcome them. This he did each evening. Peter disappeared with his flock. Heidi gently stroked first one goat and then the other, and ran around them to stroke them on the other side. She was perfectly delighted with the little creatures. "Are they ours, grandfather? Are they both ours? Will they go into the shed? Will they stay with us always?" asked Heidi, one question following the other in her delight. When the goats had finished licking their salt, the old man said, "Go and bring out your little bowl and the bread." Heidi obeyed and came back at once. The grandfather milked the goat, filled the bowl, cut off a piece of bread, saying, "Now, eat your supper, and then go to bed. Your Aunt Dee left a bundle for you. Your nightgowns and other things are in it. You will find it downstairs in the closet if you need it. I must attend to the goats now, so sleep well." "Good night, grandfather." "Good night. What are their names, grandfather? What are their names?" cried the child, running after the old man and the goats as they disappeared into the shed. "The white one is named Schwanley, and the brown one is named Barley," answered the grandfather. "Good night, Schwanley. Good night, Barley," called Heidi at the top of her voice. Then Heidi sat down on the bench and ate her bread and drank her milk, but the strong wind almost blew her off her seat. So she finished quickly, then went in and climbed up to her bed, in which she immediately fell asleep, and slept as soundly and as well as if she had been in the loveliest bed of some royal princess. Not long after, even before it was entirely dark, the grandfather also went to bed, for he always was up with the sun, and it came climbing over the mountain very early in the summertime. In the night, the wind blew with such force that its blasts made the whole hut tremble, and every rafter creaked. It howled and groaned down the chimney like voices in distress. And outside in the fir trees it raged with such fury that now and then a bough was broken off. In the middle of the night the grandfather rose and said half aloud to himself, "She may be afraid." He climbed the ladder and went to Heidi's bedside. The moon outside shone brightly in the sky for a moment and then disappeared behind the driving clouds, and everything grew dark. Then the moonlight came again brightly through the round opening and fell directly on Heidi's couch. Her cheeks were fiery red as she slept under the heavy coverlet, and she lay perfectly calm and peaceful on her little round arm. She must have been dreaming happy dreams, for a look of happiness was on her face. The grandfather gazed long at the sweetly sleeping child, until the moon went behind a cloud again, and it was dark. Then he went back to his own bed. Heidi was awakened early in the morning by a loud whistle, and when she opened her eyes, a flood of sunshine was pouring through the round window on her bed, and the hay lay close by, so that everything about shone like gold. Heidi looked around her in amazement and did not know where she was at first. Then she heard her grandfather's deep voice outside, and everything came back to her mind, where she had come from, that now she was up on the arm with her grandfather, no longer with old Ursel. Ursel was always cold, so that she liked to sit by the kitchen fire or by the stove in her chamber. Heidi had been obliged to stay very near so that the old woman could see her where she was, and because she was deaf and could not hear her. This had often been very tiresome to Heidi, who longed to run outside. So she was very glad when she awoke in her new home and remembered how many strange things she had seen the day before, and what she would see again that day, especially Schwanley and Barely. Heidi jumped quickly out of bed and in a few minutes put on all that she wore the day before. It wasn't very much. Then she climbed down the ladder and ran out in the front of the hut. There already stood the goat-herd Peter with his flock, and the grandfather was bringing Schwanley and Barely out of the shed to join the other goats. Heidi ran up to him to say good morning to him and the goats. Would you like to go to the pasture, too?" asked the grandfather. Heidi was pleased with the idea and jumped for joy. "But first wash and be clean, or else the sun will laugh at you when it is shining so brightly up there and sees that you are dirty. See, everything's ready for you." The grandfather pointed to a large tub of water standing before the door in the sunshine. Heidi ran to it and splashed and rubbed until she was all shining. Meanwhile, the grandfather went into the hut and called to Peter. "Come here, General of the Goats, and bring your haversack with you." Peter, surprised, obeyed the call and brought along the little bag in which he carried his scanty dinner. "Open it," said the old man, and he put in a large piece of bread and an equally large piece of cheese. Peter opened his round eyes as wide as possible in his amazement, for both pieces were half as large again as what he had brought for his own dinner. "Now, in goes a little bowl," continued the uncle, "for the child cannot drink the way you do right from the goat. She doesn't know how. Milk 2 bowls full at noon for her, as she is to go with you and stay until you come down again. Take care that she does not fall over the rocks. Do you hear?" Heidi came running up. "Can the sun laugh at me now, grandfather?" she asked eagerly. In fear of the sun, she had rubbed her face and neck so vigorously with the coarse towel her grandfather hung by the water tub that she looked as red as a lobster. Her grandfather smiled. "No, no, now he has nothing to laugh at," he admitted. "But tonight, when you come home, you must go in all over like a fish. For after running about like the goats, you will have black feet. Now you can march along." So she went merrily up the arm. The wind in the night had blown away the last clouds, and the sky was everywhere a deep blue, and in the midst stood the sun, shining on the green mountain. All the blue and golden yellow flowers opened their cups and looked up with gladness. Heidi jumped here and there and shouted for joy, for there were whole troops of delicate primroses together, and yonder it was blue with gentians, and everywhere in the sunshine smiled and nodded the tender-leaved golden rock roses. Heidi was so charmed by all these glistening, nodding flowers that she entirely forgot the goats and even Peter. She ran far ahead and then off to one side, for it shone red here and yellow there and enticed her in every direction. Wherever she went, she picked quantities of flowers and put them in her apron. She wanted to carry them all home and put them in the hay in her sleeping room, that it might look there as it did here. So Peter had to look everywhere, and his round eyes, which did not move quickly from one place to another, had more work than they could well manage, for the goats were as bad as Heidi. They ran hither and thither, and he was obliged to whistle and shout and swing his rod continually in order to drive all the stragglers together. "Where have you gone now, Heidi?" he called, almost angrily. "Here," sounded from some unknown, unseen place. Peter could see no one, for Heidi was sitting on the ground behind the knoll, which was thickly covered with fragrant wild flowers. She sat down among the flowers and drew in long breaths of the perfume. "Come along," called Peter again. "You must not fall down over the cliffs. The uncle charged me not to let you." "Where are the cliffs?" asked Heidi, without stirring from the place, for every breath of the wind brought the sweet fragrance to her with increasing charm. "Up there. Way up. We've still a long way to go, so come along now." "And up on the very top sits the old robber bird croaking." That succeeded. Heidi immediately jumped up and ran to Peter with her apron full of flowers. "You have enough now," he said, when they were once more climbing together. "Besides, you'll stay here forever. And if you pick them all, you won't have any more tomorrow." The last reason convinced Heidi. Besides, her apron was already so full that there was hardly room for any more, and there must be some left for tomorrow. So she went along with Peter. And the goats behaved better and hurried along without delay, for they smelt the good herbage in the distance on the high pasture land. The pasture where Peter usually went with his goats for the day lay at the foot of the high cliffs. The lower part of it was covered with bushes and fir trees, but it rose toward heaven quite bald and steep. On one side of the mountain there were deep abysses. The grandfather was quite right in warning Peter about them. When Peter reached this spot on the heights, he took off his bag and laid it carefully in a little hollow in the ground. He knew that the wind often rushed across with strong gusts, and he did not wish to see his precious possessions roll down the mountain. Then he stretched himself out on the ground in the sunny pasture to rest from the labor of climbing. In the meantime, Heidi had taken off her apron, rolled it up tightly with the flowers inside, and laid it close to the lunch bag. Then she sat down beside Peter and looked around her. The valley lay far below, in the full morning sunshine. In front of her, Heidi saw a great, wide field of snow, stretching high up into the deep blue sky. On the left stood an enormous mass of rock, on each side of which a high tower of bald, jagged cliffs rose into the sky and looked very sternly down on Heidi. The child sat as still as a mouse. Everything there was great, deep stillness. Only the wind passed very softly and gently over the tender bluebells and the radiant golden rock roses, which were everywhere gaily nodding to and fro on their slender stems. Peter had gone to sleep after his labor, and the goats were climbing among the bushes. She drank in the golden sunlight, the fresh air, the delicate fragrance of the flowers, and desired nothing more than to remain there forever. She looked up into the air, and to the largest bird she'd ever seen in her life was flying around on wide, outstretched wings and coming back in wider circles and screaming loud and piercing over her head. "Peter, Peter, wake up!" cried Heidi at the top of her voice. "See, there's the robber bird! See!" Peter jumped up at the call and looked with Heidi at the bird, which was flying higher and higher in the blue sky. Finally it disappeared over the gray cliffs. "Where has he gone now?" asked Heidi, who had watched the bird eagerly. "Home to his nest," was Peter's answer. "Is his home way up there? Oh, how lovely to be so high up. Why does he scream so?" asked Heidi again. "Because he can't help it," explained Peter. "Let's climb up there and see where his home is," proposed Heidi. Oh, burst out Peter, uttering such exclamation with strong disapproval. "No goat can get there, and the uncle said you must not fall over the cliff." Then Peter suddenly began such a whistling and calling that Heidi did not know what was going to happen. But the goats must have understood the sound, for one after another they came jumping down until the whole flock was assembled on the green slope, some nibbling the spicy stalks, others running to and fro, and still others amusing themselves by butting one another with their horns. Heidi jumped up and ran among the goats. It was new and extremely amusing to her to see how the little creatures leaped about and played together, and Heidi made the personal acquaintance of each one, for every one had a quite distinct individuality and its own peculiar ways.